Well, Australian police have identified the man who carried out a deadly knife attack in central Melbourne on Friday. Somali-born Hassan Khalif Shire Ali was shot and killed by police after he set his car on fire and stabbed 3 people. One of the victims died at the scene.
I've got to address the real issue here. I've got to call it out. Radical, violent, extremist Islam that opposes our very way of life. I'm the first to protect religious freedoms in this country, but it also means I must be the first to call out religious extremism.
That was Prime Minister Scott Morrison's reaction to the attack, and some of the Australian media has followed his lead. As officials confirmed the attacker was inspired by Daesh, a headline in The Australian read, "Violent Islam terror attack strikes Melbourne." The New Daily focused on Morrison's statement declaring extremist Islam is Australia's greatest threat. Politicians from different parties have condemned what they're calling Islamic extremism, but at the same time saying that such ideologies aren't reflective of the wider Muslim faith. Well, while using the term radical Islam, the Prime Minister also urged religious leaders to ensure radicalism doesn't grow in their communities. Well, for more on this, Todd Green joins us now from Iowa. He's a professor of religion at Luther College. He's also the author of Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. Welcome to the program. So we heard the Australian Prime Minister refer to radical violent Islam in relation to this attack. What do you think of that characterisation? Is that the right approach?
I think it's actually the absolute wrong approach, and it's wrong for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that it assumes that Islam itself is the catalyst of terrorism, or that there's something organic to Islam that drives terrorism. And what most of us as scholars of religion and other scholars of terrorism know from our studies is that Islam is rarely, if ever, the catalyst for terrorism. It's usually other political factors and social factors driving terrorism, including U.S. foreign policy, European foreign policy, militarism, the war on terror. All these contribute to the conditions that drive terrorism and oftentimes motivate people to act in the way that they do.
So explain to us why that comment made by the Australian Prime Minister is seen by some as Islamophobic.
Part of the problem is that he's calling upon Muslim leaders to speak out and condemn this terrorism and to try to prevent radicalization within their communities, which again is a presumption of guilt, right? A guilt by association mentality that because the perpetrator of this attack had a Muslim background, therefore all Muslims are guilty of latent terrorist tendencies or violent tendencies until they say and do otherwise. And that is a racist assumption, in my opinion. It's not something that would be expected of me if someone of my cultural or racial or religious background also carried out a violent attack.
And we do see this sort of reaction from leaders, particularly in Western countries, in the wake of similar attacks, that they call on ordinary Muslims to speak out against this kind of extremism. But what approach should the leaders be taking if they're not to do that?
Well, at the very least, they could simply Google Muslims condemning terrorism and they would recognize and within 10 seconds that there's lots of evidence that Muslims already are condemning terrorism. So it's redundant at best to call upon them to do so, and at worst it reflects a willful ignorance that again allows for a guilt by association mentality to fester. What they can do is be honest about what Muslims are already doing, saying and doing indeed to condemn terrorism, and they can start to recognize that in many ways it is political conditions and foreign policies and ongoing wars, ceaseless wars, perpetuated in many ways by Western powers that feed the conditions and fuel the conditions that give rise to terrorism. And by tackling those conditions and by rethinking some of our policies, we will see a reduction of terrorism, and politicians can take the lead on this.